what we're, in those situations, what Workplace Health and Safety Queensland will look at is what was your obligation to that volunteer. So, for example, I've been doing some work with Motorcycling Australia, and what they have is they conduct a series of races, or where idiots like me can get on their bikes and take them out and do track work. Now, what they do in their situation is they have incorporated bodies around Australia that might run a particular track. So, for example, Winton in Victoria. They provide a steward on race day, and the steward then makes sure the local people are trained and all that sort of stuff, and supervises the track for the day. So if we're going to look at that organisation because there's an incident at an event, we will look at what the obligations were of Motorcycling Australia with respect to the steward and what the steward's role was at the course, but also what the individual association that controls the track and how they train their flag marshals and those sorts of things. So to give you a really simple example, Meals on Wheels. Lots of people donate time to Meals on Wheels. Lots of councils and other sorts of groups run Meals on Wheels. You can have a paid person directly beside a volunteer where they're doing exactly the same work. So then you have to ask the question, well, why should the duties be any different for either of those two people? And rightly so, since 1995, the Queensland government had made a view was that those volunteers in those situations needed to be protected. What we've done, because we recognise the importance right around Australia of voluntary boards and committees, is those volunteers on that board can't be prosecuted under the Work Health and Safety Act, all right?
But who is prosecuted then,
well,
if there's an incident?
In most cases we don't prosecute. In Queensland, for example, we have between 90 and 100,000 workers' compensation claims a year, and we prosecute on around 100 to 120 cases a year through the courts. So prosecution is a very small part of our business. It would depend on the structure. I would think not, but it is the way the organisation's set up as an entity. But I would think not, because, so for example, the other night I was speaking to a show society. Now clearly in that situation, when we went through it, they were all worried. They thought, yep, they've got all these obligations, and show societies, as you can imagine, they've got every man and his dog turns up once a year, all different businesses, whole lots of electrical risks, whole lot of PCBUs. Now in that situation, when we worked through it, they had no obligations because really the couple of people were paid honorariums to assist in coordinating show days, and that at the end of the day was it. But there was a whole lot of people that attend those shows that do have that have obligations under the Act because they run individual businesses at those shows.
Probably, if I could just make a comment there as well, is that what we're talking about here is legislation. I mean, volunteers always have, and presumably always will have, their common law duties as well.
Of course.
So, I mean, there's been, to my mind, who's sort of involved in ensuring and risk management for sporting organisations, there's been a bit of a fear about this new legislation and its impact on volunteers, etc. In my opinion, if anything, it clarifies things whereby the volunteers have always had exposure, certainly under common law, and if anything, this perhaps just makes things a little bit clearer and clarifies it a little bit more.
Well, certainly under workplace health and safety law too. So under the 95 Act, volunteers were always covered too. Now, you know, between 1995 and the 1st of January this year, the sky hasn't fallen in. You haven't seen a prosecution of volunteers, and I would be surprised to see that going forward. It is possible. You know, a lot of people are worried about the penalty levels under the legislation too, and there's 3 categories of offences, and the first category, Category 1, which can have 5 years jail or I think $3 million fine. Now, we went back through all our files to look at how many cases would go into Category 1. In the last 10 years, we've found 1 case and that was a case called All Souls School, just outside of Toowoomba. Now, what happened there? A teacher, it was an agricultural college, organised and got some drums, then got the students to cut them up. Now, the drums had solvent in it. One of them exploded and killed one of the students. Now, clearly in that situation, there'd been no determination that the drums had been cleaned. And so there was a very clear example there.
Well, for my own benefit, as much as anyone else is here, being involved in this area, with the new legislation and the fact that some of the penalties could be deemed to be criminal penalties, and therefore they wouldn't be responded to the statutory liability insurance I referred to earlier. What sort of fine? Can you give us some idea as to when it might be a criminal penalty as distinct from a civil penalty?
I'd like to answer the second part of your question first. Where I think that insurance can be important is, for example, if you have an incident occur in your workplace that affects the workplace directly next to you and they have a loss, that insurance would cover that sort of situation, wouldn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good.
Yep.
So what's happened here with the approach to the courts, up until the 1st of January, prosecutions were dealt with under the Queensland Workplace Health and Safety Act through the Industrial Magistrates Court, and so it went through the industrial courts. What we did, and it come from very strong representation from employer associations, was that if we were going to increase the penalties and the burden of proof, in a sense, what they wanted was to go through the real court structure. So now offences will be prosecuted through the Magistrates Court and are appealable to the High Court, whereas previously you could go as far as the Industrial Court and that was it. That's a really good question, because I think that's probably the biggest thing for you guys collectively. Because before you could turn around and say, well, I didn't really know about it. Now there's an express obligation on you, and if we come and knock on your door, we're going to want to know if you're into abseiling, why you didn't know about, why you hadn't factored in certain aspects of that event. You're going to have to sit down and work through what the hazards and risks are. Now, I didn't go into consultation today because we were short of time, but you've got to make sure that your staff, your contractors and your volunteers then understand what those hazards and risks are and what you've put in place to mitigate it. That's probably the biggest thing to come out of it for you guys, and that is a big change. Well, again, that's looked at in the whole context of it. Those sorts of things happen every day in my workplace as well as yours. You know, people don't follow instructions or make mistakes. Now, it is possible under this legislation, which really wasn't under the previous legislation, that we may prosecute a worker in that situation. So there is the potential to do it. The only case where under the previous legislation will occur, like one case I knew of where, you know, construction workers were playing practical jokes and one put a nail gun through another one's foot into some timber planking. Now, that was prosecuted as a willful action. But generally, now there is the potential where there is a gross breach by a worker where they haven't followed the documentary procedures, or a contractor that you've set down, where that may give rise to a prosecution under this legislation. If it's all volunteers, a volunteer committee of management,
yep,
like we can have the Caxton Street Gardening Association, the Act doesn't apply to them. Again, it depends on the structure, and we can talk to you outside this. So I was talking to a maritime group the other night. Now, in state office, there's two people. There's a receptionist and the secretary, sort of come whatever. And then they've got all the different groups around who are all incorporated bodies with volunteer committees of management, and they're all volunteers. Doesn't apply to any of them. It only applies to the head office. Yeah, we've got some, the reporting requirements are more onerous now in terms of the types of things that have to be reported. If you go to our website, it's set out there and we've got some guidance material. It's fair to say what we're trying to do at the moment is get some national guidance material on that and get some agreed sort of definitions of what a spine injury is. So is it musculoskeletal or is it just discs and bone and so on? And there's some of the issues we're working through still on that type of thing. It's the person has management and control. So if I can use the example of a shopping centre, you might have 30 or 40 shops in it. You'll have the shopping centre owners who will have premises there as well. It's what's involved in the incident. So if someone slips over or whatever in the main walkways, then clearly that's the shopping centre owners. If you do some dodgy electrical work or building work within your little shop, that falls over and hits a customer or whatever, clearly that's your obligation. I don't know if you can comment on that. So it depends on control. So if they were doing abseiling an indoor facility and something gave way, then clearly the people that are responsible for that component of it would be the ones that we'd be most interested in. Again, if a school wants to organise abseiling and they employ someone in this room to do it, then clearly that person has control for the hazards and risks involved in that. They've engaged someone that they believe has the skills to do that safely. Well, yes, things happen every day. As I said to you before, we have around 90 to 100,000 workers' compensation claims a year, and most of those aren't investigated and all those sorts of things. I think the point that was made before, human nature is stuff that people do stupid things at times. We all do it, and you know, there's consequences from that.